With the assassination of John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson is going to be sworn in as President of the United States upon Aircraft One there in Dallas, there at Love Field. And standing beside him is going to be Jackie Kennedy in the bloodstained coat that she was wearing. So it's going to be a little bit interesting. And so almost immediately, Johnson is going to have to begin plotting as to whether or not he's going to run for president in 64 and being a political animal. Of course he is. And so we want to start this part off with the 64 election. And his his opponent is going to be Barry Goldwater, a Republican senator from Arizona. And Barry Goldwater, now he's not only running against LBJ, but he's running against the ghost of dead JFK. Did I say that right? He's not only running against LBJ, but the ghost of the dead JFK. Okay, got too many three-letter people. But his campaign slogan is, "In your heart, you know he's right," which LBJ's crowd turns around to, "In your guts, you know he's nuts." And he's a little bit extreme. Barry Goldwater is. And what happens is LBJ uses that ghost or that memory or that emotion of what I've called the dead Kennedy here, saying this is what John Kennedy would have wanted. This is what President Kennedy would have wanted. And the American public, like, okay. And so all of a sudden you get these crazy campaign commercials. Like at one point, Goldwater was flippantly talking about how about Florida, and so we need to saw it off and cut it out and let it float out to sea. And so LBJ comes up with this commercial where it's like a saw. It's like you see a wooden map of the United States sitting in this tub of water, and somebody's got a saw to saw it off Florida, and it floats on out. And it's basically the "in your guts, you know he's nuts" part. And so those campaign commercials get wild. The Daisy commercial, you want to have some fun, go look that one up. Aired one time. Scared the bejesus out of everybody. So this election is going to be a little different. And what happens in 64? Democrats sweep both houses of Congress. And when you sweep both houses of Congress, you know the impact that can have. You're going to get anything you want for at least a couple of years. President Obama had it in 2008. I think even Trump had it there in 2016. And usually when you control both houses, bad things tend to happen because you get too big for your britches, as one of my old coaches used to say. And so when the first thing's done, new frontier, we're going to have great society. And it's going to be a war on poverty. And you see this artwork about, the Johnson administration and his great society. And it's like a movie war poster. I mean, it's awful because we see the Vietnam backdrop and we have not spoken about that yet. I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But Vietnam is going to undergird everything that Johnson does, including his war on poverty. Kennedy had gotten us in by sending advisors, and there is some speculation that he wanted us out. But now that Johnson's come in, Johnson's a Texan, and every little boy in Texas learned in school about the Alamo and about how Colonel Travis drew a line in the sand with his sword and said anybody who wanted to leave, step over that line. And one person did. And I can't call their name now, obviously, but every schoolboy in Texas knew it. And you didn't want to be that guy, that coward, they called him. And Johnson would always say when they asked him about Vietnam, he said, "Oh, hell, boys, it's just like the Alamo." But he's going to also, not only is he going to fight a war in Vietnam, a very strange war in Vietnam, but we're going to have a war on poverty in America and a war on discrimination. And when you see, remember that health care for older folks that Kennedy wanted? Boom, Johnson gets it, Medicare. For poor people, boom, Medicaid, still around. HUD, okay? The Housing and Urban Development. The 24th Amendment, which is that's continuity of government. The Civil Rights Act of 64, which is going to prevent all this discrimination in the polling place. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Busing to achieve integration. And lastly, a Voting Rights Act to prevent some of the foolishness that goes on with voting as well. And so you look at some of these things in the Great Society, and they're really kind of cool and make a lot of sense. But, so there's you got to balance Lyndon Johnson. You've got Lyndon Johnson, the domestic president, and you've got Lyndon Johnson, the generalismo of Vietnam. And those two just don't mesh very well. But the civil rights movement is going to turn from one of nonviolence to a core within the movement that want black separatism, led by Malcolm Little, or he called Little his slave name, so he changed it to X, so Malcolm X, and it's this move toward militantism. All right. And so you have the Malcolm X faction, which is very militant, and violent's not really the right word, but we can use that in its place. We have him, versus Martin Luther King. So you have Malcolm Little, now Malcolm X. They formed the Black Panther Party. You have riots break out in Watts area of Los Angeles, during the summer. And these things always happen during the summer when it's hot. Nobody riots when it's cold. It's amazing. Part of them are backlashes against that war in Vietnam, where you have an inordinate percentage of African Americans who are drafted and have to fight. So there's backlash against that. There's backlash against this lack of opportunity in America, that racism and some of the segregation that were still embedded at this particular time. So you've got that going on during Johnson's administration. Then there's also a counterculture. I mean, check out the hippies right here. So baby boomers have become disillusioned. If you go back to the beats or the beatniks of the 50s, this is an outgrowth. And a lot of these are university students, which are some of the most radical places in America. I don't think Gardner Webb's of that variety, but some of the bigger ones like University of California at Berkeley or Columbia University in New York were. And Students for a Democratic Society, that's your professional protesters. They create chapters all around the country. We see things like it happen at Woodstock. And so you see this counterculture movement where people are, hey, listen, our society that we've grown up in, this conformity and keeping up with the Joneses and this materialism is quite simply not the road the country needs to go down. What's amazing is that these counterculture folks, these hippies as we would call them, are now almost my parents' age, if not their age. And so that's kind of wild that some of the older generation was this counterculture that moved America into, in so many ways, the modern world. But none of this is going to work without the Supreme Court. And we have the Warren Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren, that was installed by Eisenhower. And the Warren Court is going to come up with so many landmark decisions that strengthen civil rights that it's not funny. First is Miranda versus Arizona. It says you have to be read your rights if you're arrested and questioned. Gideon versus Wainwright, which is going to say that Gideon is going to be there. You have the right to if you can't afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. I'm sorry, I had a little moment right there. There's Escobedo versus Illinois. And we get these things right here. And what it does is all of a sudden the power of the government's kind of reined in a little bit. And civil rights are expanded a little bit. Now, of course, you got people in America who say that they are too active and he's too liberal and we need to impeach Earl Warren. No. You start looking at this stuff right here. These are things today that we take as part and parcel of our civil rights. We're too busy arguing about whether or not we're going to wear a mask on Thanksgiving. And, you're looking at being read your rights at arrest or the right to have an attorney appointed for you if you couldn't afford one. I mean, goodness, those are core rights, not this whole mask thing. And then the last slide here, this one is about feminism. And you get the rise of that. There's Betty Friedan. She's going to spin around a little bit. But Betty Friedan, who wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique. And she said, listen, women are not happy being homemakers. They need to have careers too. At the Brown House, whether you're happy being a homemaker or not, we're going to have a career because we need two incomes. And then now it's not like now, it's the National Organization for Women, much like the NAACP, except for females. And then there was a proposal for the Equal Rights Amendment. Said that women should have equal rights, equal pay, something we're still arguing about to this day. And it passes through the Congress but fails at the state level. Because the states are generally a little bit more conservative than the Congress is. But then there's one big old giant case, Roe versus Wade. And Roe versus Wade, it was about a woman having an abortion, and people say, oh, Roe versus Wade guaranteed people that right. Well, hold on. It deals with the right to privacy. And that's how it comes through. And there's a lot of question about whether Roe versus Wade will survive. Don't know. That's why history's so fun. We get to see that ebb and flow. So that's rights for women right there. Roe versus Wade are reproductive rights. And then Title IX, which said you can't discriminate in schools or all this kind of stuff on the basis of sex. And then lastly, you get these changes in attitudes and perceptions. And if you're like me, you're looking at it going, well, yeah. Because to us today, this is the way things kind of ought to be. But in the 1960s, this was cutting edge and radical and scary to a lot of people. I really wish my grandfathers were still alive to ask them about this, because I can just imagine some of what they would say. So that's where we look at in the 1960s, and that gets us up to the Vietnam conflict and in 1968. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut this week off right here because I want to deal with Vietnam and 68 a little bit differently because they are such watershed moments for America.